Okay, all right. Hi, welcome to the Physionic Podcast. This is not my first time doing this live, but this is the first time using a particular program that has to be input between YouTube and myself. So I'm hoping that it's working. If not, then you'll have to excuse the live stream. Hopefully it'll turn out okay in terms of the podcast later on. So we'll just have to wait how things turn out. But if you're listening to this after the fact, then welcome. My name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD student in molecular medicine. I have my master's in exercise physiology. And today I've got a really interesting topic. I pretty much always say that because I like to pick interesting topics. This is actually a brand new study it just got published 10 days ago. So it's incredibly new. It's called Alterations in Body Composition. If you're watching this on the live stream, this is what it's called: Alterations in Body Composition, Resting Metabolic Rate, Muscular Strength, and Eating Behavior in Response to Natural Bodybuilding Competition Preparation, a case study. So this study is essentially going to try and figure out what kind of changes occur to the body when a person undergoes extreme dieting. And we're talking getting down to really, really low body fat percentages, 5-6% body fat. So this study isn't going to necessarily tell us if all of this is applicable to everyone else, because there are no averages. This is just a single person that they're following over a set period of time. But what it does tell us is if there can be changes. And as we'll see, there are some really interesting changes and some things that are probably not that expected. You wouldn't necessarily expect these particular changes to occur, but I'll leave that for once we get to those points. We got a lot of data to go through, but hopefully we can walk away with some pretty interesting information. So let me give you a bit of background as usual on the study. What they want to investigate is adaptations that occur with extreme fat loss. So again, you're not talking about, let's say, if you're a man moving from 16% body fat to 9% body fat. 9% body fat is incredibly lean, but it's not competition lean. And so this is specifically looking at a natural bodybuilder. And this study investigated one 25-year-old bodybuilder that underwent a 6-month pre-competition fat loss phase in preparation for 4 shows, and then went through 3 months of competition. So you got the 6 months plus, so preparing for the shows, then you've got the 3 months of actually being in the competition, and then months 9 through 12 are essentially recovery. So we're going to see what happens over a 6-month diet through that phase where he's trying to maintain that leanness, and then what happens with the rebound, what happens with the recovery afterwards. And they took measures after each month. So they had this person come in, as well as around the competitions during the peaking phase. The peaking phase is a point where you deplete your carbohydrate intake, get yourself really flat, and then you intake a bunch of carbohydrates, and there's a process called supercompensation where your muscle cells will take up more carbohydrates, more glycogen. So suddenly you glycogen load and you look really phenomenal. You look really full. And so that's what they end up doing for the competitions, which makes sense. The different measures that they had were measures in muscle mass, body fat, those are obvious, blood pressure, as well as a few different blood biomarkers like testosterone levels. I know that'll probably be really interesting to some of you. Blood sugar levels, thyroid hormone, which is another really interesting one, and a few others, while also assessing heart rate and metabolic rate. That's going to be really, really interesting as well. Power and strength as well. So this is all done after an 8-hour fast, which, if I'm honest, I typically prefer to see something along the lines of a 12-hour fast, but an 8-hour fast is probably the minimum that a person can pull off, or researchers can pull off. So after an 8-hour fast, they made all these measurements. Talking about his training frequency, I'm not going to go into all the details. I'm not even going to throw up the graphs of kind of what he was going through. It was all kinds of stuff. I've got the study linked. If you're listening to this after the fact, or if you're listening to this live, I've got the study link. So I don't know if you have access to it, but if not, if you don't see the data for yourself, you can hop on over to Instagram, where I'll be posting some more of that data that corresponds to this particular study. So his training frequency ranged from 3 to 7 times a week, and it really depended on what phase of the dieting he was going through. If he was like 4 months in, if he was 6 months in, etc. With the majority of the training frequency sitting around 5 to 6 days a week. So he's going pretty hard. And if you look at the volume that he's doing ridiculous amounts of volume. As a matter of fact, his workout strategy probably wasn't that ideal. He probably was feeling pretty terrible during this dieting phase. So he was training for the majority of the time 5 to 6 days a week, with full body workouts at an intensity of 1 to 4 reps in reserve. Reps in reserve is if you are lifting weights and you're lifting a particular weight as much as you possibly can. Let's say you're on rep 6, rep 7, rep 8, repetition, meaning the number of times that you lift the weight. You eventually hit a point where you can't lift the weights anymore. That would be reps in reserve 0, right? So that's failure. Now, if you have reps in reserve 1, that means that you stopped 1 shy of failure. If you have reps in reserve 3, then you have 3 reps left. So if you're going to reps in reserve 3, then most likely you're not going really close to, or too close to failure, but you're at least getting some stimulation of the musculature. So that's probably how he was able to pull off the fact that he was doing a full body workout, which I think the authors even said, the researchers even said that was less than ideal. But for the most part, he performed reps in reserve 3, and he had a whole host of different rep ranges. So he would work in 3 rep range, as well as all the way up to 30 repetitions. And then across the entire training time. So across the entire 12 months, it's not like he ever stopped, but he usually stuck within 6 to 15 repetitions for 3 to 4 sets per exercise. And he ended up doing a lot of different exercises. So I imagine he was in the gym for a long time, every single day, leading up to this competition and beyond. Finally, to talk a little bit about supplements that he was taking vitamin D, he was taking a multivitamin with ashwagandha root, and he was taking fish oil, creatine, green tea extract, as well as pre-workout and coffee and energy drinks, amounting to, this is pretty stunning, maybe not to some of you, but to 500 to 1,000 milligrams of caffeine a day. That's a lot of caffeine. 1,000 milligrams of caffeine is a lot of caffeine, but I certainly don't blame him, because once you get to low enough body fat percentage and you've been dieting for long enough, you start feeling really lethargic. It doesn't take long for you to start feeling incredibly tired throughout the day. So he probably needed a good boost in that particular arena. But stopped all caffeine intake during his peak week. So again, leading up to his competitions, those last few days before his competitions, he would stop caffeine intake. So that's the background. Now, if you're watching the podcast, I'm going to quick post what his post a picture of his competition, what he actually looked like. So you can tell that he's incredibly lean, as you can see. So the guy clearly got in excellent shape. And as a natural bodybuilder, he had to get to extremely low body fat percentage. And we'll see exactly how low of body fat percentage he ended up going down to, although he started out pretty high already. So for the results, I'm not going to post every single result that was that was up. Like I said, they had tables for like the volume, the amount of work that he did over a week, the amount of cardio that he did. I'm going to skip over that. You can certainly look at it for yourself, and I'll see if I can post it somewhere so that you have access to it as well. And so I'll start with figure 3, where where the researchers are talking about the number of calories that he consumed. So when it came to caloric consumption over time, obviously it's broken up between carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, respectively. So the calories, of course, dropped over time. So for the first 2 weeks, he was consuming around 3,000 calories. So clearly, he has a pretty high metabolic rate, or TDEE, a total daily energy expenditure. That's well over 3,000. It's probably around 3,400 or 3,500, something along those lines. But if he can drop down to 3,000 and start losing weight, that's pretty phenomenal. So 3,000 calories in the first 2 weeks, with 316 grams of carbohydrates, 301 grams of protein, and 61 grams of fat. Again, probably completely unnecessary. 300 grams of protein, he could have easily switched that out for more carbohydrates or more fats, and he probably would have had the exact same results. Eating 300 grams of protein, I mean, I imagine he probably wasn't all that hungry in the first 2 weeks because you're not getting that many changes, but 300 grams of protein is completely unnecessary. However, obviously over time, he slowly continued to decrease because you have to go through the stepwise decrease from starting at a particular point and slowly decreasing based off of the scale. So if on the scale you're no longer losing weight, then that's at least an indication, one of the indications that you need to then coax your body to release more body fat. And the way to do that is by reducing your caloric intake. So at the lowest calorie consumption, so this is roughly around that 6-month mark, because again, he ends up dieting for 6 months for the pre-competition dieting, as I'll show you on the screen if you're watching this live or watching the podcast itself. He goes down to roughly 1,950 calories. So and 104 grams of carbohydrates, so really low carbohydrates, 253 grams of protein, and 57 grams of fat. So he leaves his fat relatively stable, which is good because otherwise he probably would have suffered even more. But again, 253 grams of protein, the guy didn't weigh an enormous amount. He certainly didn't weigh 250, 300 pounds. So was this really necessary at somebody who weighs probably 100 kilograms or less? No, 253 grams of protein is, again, he could have easily thrown that into carbs and probably gotten a little bit better results at this rate. And that's, of course, after those initial 6 months. So then the recovery diet, so again, there was that 6 months down, and then the 3 months of competition, and then there's the recovery diet for another 3 months. That was on day 230, so post-competition. He jumped up to 3,400 calories, so maybe that's right around where his TDEE that I mentioned earlier is actually. So 3,400 calories, jumped up to 386 grams of carbs, 263 grams of protein, completely unnecessary again, and 95 grams of fat. And so that lowest calorie consumption was over 40% reduction from his recovery diet. So around the point where he maintains weight or slightly gains weight, he was consuming 40% less than that to achieve the physique that he ended up achieving for his bodybuilding competition. Now, in those few days, that peak week where he's over consuming carbohydrates, that peak week consumption, he jumped his calories from less than 2,000, as I mentioned before, around 1950, to around 3,500 calories, and his carbohydrates hovered close to 500 grams. So suddenly he jumps up from from 100 grams, about 100 grams, 104 grams, to 500 grams. And, that fills the musculature up quite considerably. I mean, within a few days, probably 2 or 3 days, the muscle cells are full with glycogen. They're going to be pulling in water as well. So he's going to look really, really great as a result. And that's, again, from less than 100 grams. So protein remained the same, and his fat increased to around 90. So a pretty substantial bump there from around 60 grams of fat to 90 grams of fat. Okay, so that's his diet. That's the way he went about his diet. Is it ideal? No, it's not, if I'm completely honest. Okay, so now let me throw up this showing the body fat percentage that he ended up experiencing. If I can get this to work. Oh, okay, there we go. All right, so here you're seeing, and I've color-coded things, so hopefully things are clear. Again, if you're just listening to the podcast, don't worry. I'm going to explain everything as we go through. You don't have to see the data to understand what I'm going to be explaining. So this data is pretty clearly outlined. It's months 1 through 12. Again, those first 6 months are for the fat loss, 3 months for the competition time, the 4 competitions that he's in, and then the remaining 3 months for the recovery. So dieting time, competition time, and recovery time. And, well, it was roughly 2 to 3 months for his competition time. And you can see that through skin fold measurements, which they actually verified with bioimpedance analysis, which are both different ways of measuring body fat percentage. I just went ahead and threw up the skin fold measurements because those are going to be done by an expert that knows how to do skin fold measurements. He started out at around 8%, 8.2% body fat. So the guy was already quite lean beforehand, but certainly not competition lean. And then around competition time, he dropped to about 4.4% body fat. So he had cut his body fat percentage almost in half as a result of this 6-month diet. So certainly grueling, and clearly, if you've seen the picture, just think of a bodybuilder. Really think about those shredded bodybuilders. If you're just listening to this, that's exactly what he looked like. Then in his recovery time, when he came back out of the competition, he jumped back up. They missed 2 of the measurements. That's why you're seeing this strange symbol if you're looking at the data yourself. But at the 11th month mark, they do measure his body fat percentage, and it's back up to 6.1%. So clearly he's had a rebound in some of his body fat percentage. Still unbelievably lean, but just not competition lean. And we will certainly understand why that is the case in just a little bit. So that's what happened with his body fat percentage. So to speak on that just a little bit more in terms of weight loss, and this is really going to put things into perspective, is that for all the weight lost, so he lost about 10.4% of his body weight over 6 months, 46% of that body weight, again, body weight is just overall weight, it doesn't tell you if it's fat mass or lean mass, 46% of that was body fat, and 54% was fat-free mass. Now, let me go ahead and throw this stipulation in here. 54% was fat-free mass. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean muscle mass, although let's be real, probably he lost some muscle, and we will actually see some data on that. So he likely lost some muscle, but there's also distinctions between skeletal muscle and like smooth muscle. And something that I think people often lose sight of is the fact that if your stomach is consuming less and less calories, is consuming less and less food, it also has less work that it needs to go through, like a process known as peristalsis, where it's slowly moving food down your intestinal tract. Well, the way that it does that is through smooth muscle. So if those smooth muscles are being used less, then of course you're going to lose some of that smooth musculature. Now, of course, once you rebound, then you end up regaining that smooth musculature. Your body's just adapting to what it's being given. So that makes complete sense. However, that does not mean that he likely did not lose some skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle being like your arms and your legs and your chest and back, and those areas that are the glory muscle, what people want to accentuate, their abs, things like that. That's skeletal muscle. So although he lost more fat-free mass, it's not necessarily the muscles that all of us care about the most, the vanity, arm muscles, et cetera, skeletal muscle. So in the following 3 to 4 months of recovery, he regained 9.7% of his body weight from that 10.4% loss. Well, he regained about 9.7%. So his body weight then shot back up, and 53% gained was fat mass, and 47% was fat-free mass. Now, it is certainly easier to gain fat than it is muscle. So did he lose some musculature? It seems that most likely he did. And we will actually, why not? I will jump straight into that now. So to show you that data, we're going to be looking at muscle thickness. So that's what they measured. So the muscle thickness, again, if you're looking at the data, you get that initial 6 months or so, and then you've got the competition time, which I've got labeled there for the 2 months, and then the recovery. So you've got this line graph that's essentially showing you the same site being measured. Is the muscle larger? Has it decreased, et cetera, et cetera? So by comparison to, let's say, month 1, month 2 seem to have a slight increase in muscle mass. So is that because of measurement error? It could be. It's difficult to tell because you're looking at one person, so you're not getting any sort of, in statistics, what would be called like a standard deviation, where it's telling you kind of the spread of the data because you're only looking at one person. So maybe if they had done multiple measures, if they had done, let's say, 5 measures every single time that he came in, then at least they could get some sort of average to then build off of. But they just focus on one single point. So, but the point being that, no pun intended, that there is an increase in his muscle thickness, just a little bit, just a slight bump. Then over the next, 4 months or so, 1, 2, 3, 4, around, let's say 3 to 4 months of that dieting phase, he maintains his musculature that he had at the very beginning of the study. So that's great to see. So he's getting leaner, but his muscle mass is being preserved. And then suddenly there's a pretty significant dip around month 5, and then around month 6 and 7, when he's actually in that competition time, when he's trying to maintain that level of leanness, suddenly he sees a precipitous drop in his muscle mass or muscle thickness. So that could be, and probably is, an indication that this is only one measure, so we can't 100% say, but it's a good indication that he's probably lost some muscle mass, which makes sense because he's incredibly lean. If he's 4%, even if skin calipers are off by a few percent, he's still unbelievably lean. So of course you're going to lose some musculature as a result. So, but the positive news, however, is on the recovery time, he then regained all of his musculature. So he regained that muscle thickness, with glycogen, with the muscle contractile units, everything then was replaced, at least for the muscle that they ended up measuring. Now, did it happen immediately? No, it started to increase after 1 month recovery. Then it was right back to right about where it was at the beginning of the study after 2 months of recovery. So he's lifting weights this entire time, and he's trying to improve his strength and get back to where he was. So, and then by the 3rd or 4th month of recovery, then he's definitely back to where he was. So what does this really tell us, real quick before I'll go over this again at the end, but what does this tell us? That if you lose some musculature over time from dieting, don't be too scared. I mean, you might lose it for that time, but the moment you start reintroducing calories, that musculature will come back, so long as you're, of course, trying to promote that it returns by weightlifting. So muscle thickness increased 3% over the first month of dieting, which certainly could be measurement error. I mean, I imagine it certainly could be, but then stayed stable for 4 months, like I mentioned, before plummeting 1 month before during the competition, and where he saw about a 7% loss in muscle thickness, and then muscle thickness rebounded over the following 3 months. Okay, so that is essentially looking at the muscle. Now, I'd like to touch on the resting metabolic rate. So this is metabolism, but I'm going to give you a little more context on what this really is, because it's not as simple as just saying it's metabolism. So here, again, if you're looking at the data, and of course I'm going to explain it, they tested his resting metabolic rate using a process known as indirect calorimetry, where they're essentially, I'm not going to go too much into detail with this, but they're measuring the oxygen consumption and the release of carbon dioxide. How does that relate to metabolism? Well, your mitochondria use oxygen, and they also produce carbon dioxide. So you're able to get a ratio of that, and then it gives you an idea of what your metabolism is. So this is, for more context, this is resting metabolic rate. So this is not telling you the TDEE that I was mentioning earlier. Total daily energy expenditure takes into consideration physical activity, and it also takes into consideration what's called the thermic effect of food, which is only about 10%, maybe less than that, of your total metabolism. So TDEE is your total metabolism. So when I give you the numbers here, don't suddenly freak out, and because recall that he's eating around 3,400, 3,500 calories once he's in that rebound stage. So clearly, if you end up following what I'm about to tell you, you'd think, wow, he would put on fat so quickly as a result. So where did he start? His resting metabolic rate at the beginning was around 2,200 calories. Again, this is resting metabolism. This is about 60 to 70% of his total metabolism, but you still need to tack on that physical activity and the thermic effect of food to get his total metabolism. So his resting metabolism was around 2,200 calories, and it stayed around that for a good 2 months or so, 3 months. And then it slowly decreased. So it stayed within about 25 calories. So every time he came in to get his resting metabolism checked, it was within about 25 calories, which is pretty strict. However, then around month 4, you start really seeing a decrease. And really by month 7 and 8, when he's in that competition phase, he's down. His metabolism has decreased about 1,800 calories a day, which means that he saw about a 20% drop. That is a sizable drop in metabolism. And this is, I love this because this really hammers home the point that if you're dieting for a long time, or really just dieting in general, you can't expect to consume a particular amount of calories and your body will indefinitely just linearly just decrease in body weight. That's not how it works. Your body will adapt to the circumstances that you are applying to it. So that's exactly what we see here. So you're not getting just that linear decrease. You're getting this, it's maintain, and then it reaches about a certain body fat percentage, and bunch of different changes occur, and we'll be going into some of those hormones in just a little bit, but a bunch of different changes occur. You've got changes in leptin, changes in potentially testosterone, thyroid, et cetera, and then you have this crash. This metabolism starts to slow down. It doesn't stay within that strict about 25 calorie standard deviation. What it's doing is decreasing, and in this case by 20%. So that's pretty sizable. So of course, then over the course of a diet, that shows you that most likely you're going to have to decrease your calories to make up for that, to continue to push your body to drop weight, because otherwise, where its metabolism, its basal metabolism, its metabolism to maintain your weight was at a certain point. Now it's decreased. So the calories that you were consuming to lose weight are no longer viable. Like you need to drop your calories even further. So this is a great graph. I really like the fact that they showed it the way that they did. But again, the explanation is plenty good as well. So he goes down to 1,800 calories, a 20% drop. And then once he goes back into his recovery date, you see this linear increase back up to 2,200 calories. But how long did that take, right? It took 2, 3, 4 months, something along those lines, around 3 months, around 4 months to see that increase back up to what he had before, around 2,200 calories. But what's nice is that his metabolism didn't jump up to 2,200 calories. It actually jumped up to almost 2,400 calories. So he had an increase of 180 calories over the initial 2,200 calories that he had at the beginning of the study. So although he had a 20% drop during competition, he had an 8% increase at the end of the study. Now, does that persist? Who knows? Maybe it's because he gained a little bit more muscle, although 180 calories is a lot of calories to attribute to muscle, because per pound of muscle, you're gaining about 6 calories a day. Yeah, so it's not a whole lot. So unless he put on like 20 pounds of muscle, which that definitely did not happen, this doesn't account for it. But maybe the reintroduction of, more musculature, as well as hormones regulating and whatnot, thyroid coming back into play, that could certainly play factors. So there's all kinds of different explanations, but ultimately his caloric or his metabolism, resting metabolism, then jumped back up to slightly above, and I imagine it probably went back down to around 2,200. So there is the metabolism data. Now, this is really interesting stuff. Okay, these next few pieces of information are related to his hormones, which is what a lot of people are really interested in. They want to know what happens to your testosterone, what happens, and really specifically the quality of your testosterone. Looking at blood glucose levels, so blood sugar levels, looking at LDL cholesterol, and looking at, well, I've got 2 other things that I want to discuss. One of them being thyroid, and the other one I'll let you know in just a second. So let's look at blood sugar. So for blood sugar, again, pre-diet, he wasn't diabetic, he wasn't pre-diabetic, he had good blood sugar levels, as you would hope, as if you want to consider a bodybuilder and athlete, being an active individual. So he had a blood glucose of 89 milligrams per deciliter. That's good. Then after 6 months of dieting, it went down to 81 milligrams per deciliter. That's not all that shocking. Again, if you're going to be losing weight, especially if you're going to be losing not a lot of weight, but if you're going to be getting even lower in your body fat percentage, in any situation that you lose weight, most likely you're going to see at least a slight decrease in blood sugar levels. Then 30 days post-diet, so this is in recovery, his blood sugar levels remained about the same. I know it shows it was 81, now it's 82. That's really negligible. That's not much of a difference. Then after 60 days, so after 2 months of recovery, of being on his recovery diet, he was back up to about 88. So right around where he was pre-diet. So things are starting to regulate in terms of his blood sugar. So is it shocking that his blood sugar decreases a little bit and then rebounds back? No, it's not at all shocking. It's completely expected. Now let's discuss testosterone. So I know a lot of people are really interested in that. So let's jump into that. So let's break this down. His testosterone at the beginning of the study was 543 nanograms. 543 nanograms is in the normal range. It's good. And I can certainly talk on testosterone. Again, I have content on testosterone, but essentially it's in the normal range. It's good. However, anything below, in this situation, below about 265 nanograms is considered deficient in testosterone, having not the appropriate amount of testosterone for your age, sex, etc. So after 6 months of dieting, what happens? Well, he sees his testosterone drop to 197 nanograms. So you can see a pretty significant drop in testosterone. So that's a 64% drop in testosterone. That is massive, massive drop in testosterone. So clearly you're starting to see some changes, some pretty dramatic changes in the hormonal profile of his body. And so you can imagine he was probably incredibly lethargic and was really struggling in the gym. I mean, all kinds of issues. And probably impotent as well, to be honest. So then after 30 days, his testosterone, does it rebound? Yes, it does. So in the recovery diet, after only 30 days, his testosterone flies back up to about normal levels, slightly above, but relatively in that range. So 595. His old was 543. His new is 595. Then a further 30 days later, so 2 months after the competitions, his testosterone is now around 700. Now, should you read into that and say, well, dieting lowers your testosterone, but then once you rebound, you're going to be in this great position where you have more testosterone, you can build more muscle, et cetera, et cetera. That's not how it works. So if you're thinking that, just throw that out. If you're within the normal range, there's really almost no added benefit to being slightly higher in the normal range. When you start seeing benefits in testosterone is when you're taking supraphysiological levels, so over 1,000 nanograms of testosterone in the bloodstream. Now, the other nuance here is that they also mention SHBG, which is sex hormone binding globulin. Now, the way testosterone works, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail with this, but essentially that you have the testosterone molecule that can be bound by this sex hormone binding globulin. Now, as SHBG binds testosterone, it then inhibits the movement of testosterone into the cells, into the musculature, into all kinds of other cells throughout the entire body, but we're focused on musculature. And that leads it to be inert, essentially. So it's just circling around in your bloodstream, but it's not actually doing anything, or at least based off of the current evidence that we have. So his bound testosterone, so SHBG is called bound testosterone, so that's what I'm going to call it instead of using the mouthful sex hormone binding globulin. Bound testosterone was 43.1. So of his total testosterone, which was 543, 43.1, or we'll just call it 43, was bound testosterone. So he had about 500 of maybe semi-bound and as well as free testosterone. Most of it is probably semi-bound. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail with that at the moment because I don't want to get off on a tangent. But essentially, so his bound testosterone is 43. So what happens to his bound testosterone once he ends this 6-month dieting and he's into this competition stage? After those 6 months dieting, it goes up to 56. So you don't want that. You don't want to see an increase in your bound testosterone because, again, that removes testosterone out of your system that's then bioavailable, that's actually able to be used by the cells. So not only did his total testosterone massively decrease by, again, I think I said 64% decrease, he also had a 30% increase in his bound testosterone. So he's getting hit from both ends, and he there's nothing to be done about that. Although I will say maybe it could have helped if he had cut back on his proteins and introduced more carbohydrates and especially consumed a bit more fat. That probably would have helped. But he did what he did. So are these numbers necessarily like, can you look at these numbers and say, okay, well, this is absolutely applicable to every other person? No. What we're saying here is that it is possible that your testosterone will decrease as a result of extreme dieting and to very low body fat. So then 30 days post-diet, remember that his total testosterone had jumped back up to normal. What happened to the bound testosterone? That actually decreased back to the levels that it was before the dieting started, before the fat loss phase started. So do you see decreases in testosterone in this case? Yes. Do you see increases in bound testosterone? Yes. So overall, is it due to the lack of fat intake? Is it due to the extreme weight loss itself? Or is it due to the calorie consumption, the lack of calorie consumption? We don't know. We don't actually know that. It's hard to tease out. You'd need to run other experiments to figure that out. But the bottom line is testosterone gets worse overall, and then it gets better just 1 month later. So it's something that rebounds quite easily. Okay, the other things, so a few other things before I jump into thyroid. And the final point is I also wanted to mention that his lipid A, or LDL, a particular type of LDL, decreased during the diet as well, only about 5%. His LDL wasn't bad. It decreased about 5%, and then it increased again, I think, after 60 days, if I'm not mistaken. Let me quick check on the study itself. No, so it took 60 days for it to get back up to where it was before. So LDL, just like blood sugar, is going to decrease, and then it's going to rebound once you end that dieting phase. And certainly that's an association with the increase in resting metabolic rate. So there's a lot of things that still need to be teased out if this were to be a study with multiple participants. But as it's only one person, all we can say is that this is interesting, and at least it occurs. Will it occur to you? We don't know, at least not based off of this case study. Okay, so the next one is looking at thyroid. So here's the thing. There are two main forms of thyroid. There's T3 and there's T4, T3 being the most potent. So I'm just throwing that up here. So his T3, which T3 is going to also have a massive role in metabolism because it has an effect in our cells on things like differentiation. What is differentiation? That's if you have stem cells, which we all have stem cells, if those stem cells need to be moved into a particular type of cell, they need to be convinced to turn into, let's say, a muscle cell, or they need to be convinced to turn into an immune cell, then that is the process of differentiation. Now, of course, that whole cell cycle, that whole change of the cell takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy. So, of course, metabolism will be based off of the energy consumption of those cells. So as just one example, so then thyroid, if you have decreases in that T3, then you're going to have less of these effects on these cells, and therefore you're going to get less differentiation. You're going to get all kinds of things that would modulate metabolism are then downregulated. They're decreased. So his T3 initially was normal. It was at 3. Then after 6 months of dieting, anything below 2 is considered quote unquote bad for your T3. So after 6 months of dieting, he was down to 1.4. So over half of his T3 had been cut out of his system at this point after the 6 months of dieting. So then what does that mean in terms of his recovery? Well, he largely recovered his T3 after 30 days, but he definitely recovered his T3 after 60 days. Now here you see a slight bump in his T3. Again, I can't necessarily say that this is the reason why his resting metabolic rate was higher, a little bit higher, 8% higher after the recovery time, after the 2 to 3 months of recovery. But at least there's an association there between slight increase in T3 and a slight increase in resting metabolic rate. And as we know that those two are associated, at least then, or we know that they're heavily linked, is it feasible? Yeah, sure. It's possible that because you saw an increase in T3, that's what affected his metabolism. Now, maybe his T3 then goes back down to 3 instead of sticking around 3.3, and then his metabolism would do the same thing. Then at least you'd have a cause and effect relationship, but we can't tell that right off the bat, not off of this data. But essentially all you need to know is that his thyroid decreased. So his T3 decreased, and then it rebounded essentially after the first 30 days, but definitely after the 60 days, after 2 months. So that was T3. And then I wanted to mention one more thing that I found really interesting, which actually feeds into this whole metabolism idea. It feeds into immunity, it feeds into thyroid, and it feeds into testosterone. So his white blood cell count was reduced. So he had a certain value, and I'm not going to throw up the numbers because it's not that important, but his white blood cell count, which is his immune cells, some of his immune cells, were at a certain point in a normal range. Then after the 6 months of dieting, they were drastically low, about a 30% decline, almost a 30% decline in his white blood cell count. So does that make him more prone to infections, things like that? Yeah, probably. But after 30 days, his white blood cell count then rebounded. Now, as I mentioned, that is associated with something like thyroid. Makes sense, because the thyroid will have an effect on differentiation, which one of the main cells that goes through this differentiation process that I was talking about is white blood cells. They come from stem cells. So these stem cells will then go through this differentiation process and turn into particular white blood cells, and then go out and circulate throughout our bloodstream. So is it shocking that he was under consuming on all these different things? His thyroid decreased, testosterone decreased, et cetera, and that his white blood cells count decreased? No, it's not. But if this actually persists for other people as well, it might be interesting. It might be something to keep in mind, that you may not want to drastically diet if you are, going into like flu season, or the issue that we're having right now with in across the world. I don't want to say the word, because apparently it might suppress content on the YouTubes, but you get my point. So if it's like flu season or whatnot, you may actually want to consider, not dieting down to at least extremely low body fat percentage, because then you might be more susceptible to getting sick as a result. And that could be true of really any sort of infection. Okay, so in terms of additional information, I did want to cover a few other things, like his what were his levels of uncontrollable eating, which I think is really, really interesting, and it's something that a lot of people struggle with when they're dieting. So I'm going to touch on that in just a second. But first, just a quick touch on blood pressure and heart rate. Both of those decreased with the diet. Again, is that shocking? His LDL decreased, his blood sugar decreased. So, his blood pressure, yeah, of course, it's going to decrease a little bit, not substantially. It wasn't like this massive drop or anything like that. But then again, he wasn't in a pathological state. So again, clear. So then the other thing is strength increased throughout the diet by about 15%, at least based off of measures. And but his power decreased. So the speed by which he was able to move the weights decreased a little bit, but it was only 3%. So again, do we actually know if that's replicable? If that's if you had more individuals, you'd be able to figure out if that really applies to a wider body of individuals. We don't know that, but his amount of weight that he could lift was increased, but the speed by which he was moving the weights was slightly decreased. And finally, uncontrolled eating measures. So this is just a psychological questionnaire that they asked him to fill out, and it was 0 to 100. So if he had uncontrollable eating, it would be higher. So just to keep that in reference. So at the beginning of the study, his number that he came up with was 15. So low on the uncontrollable eating measure scale. However, by month 8, which is around that competition time, at the end of that competition time, he had jumped up to 56. So it tells you, and this is not shocking either, that when you're dieting for long periods of time and get to really low body fat percentages, that could increase your risk of things like binging. That makes complete sense. But keep in mind that this phenomenon could also be occurring with individuals that are at higher body fat percentages. It doesn't have to necessarily be just because he's going down to unbelievably low body fat percentage. It could be that a person is at 25% body fat and they're trying to diet down to 23% body fat, but they're really struggling as they're getting near the tail end of their diet because their binging index, or I should say their uncontrolled eating measures, then increase as a result. So it doesn't have to necessarily be in this case. Again, because we don't know if this is necessarily teased out because of his weight, the actual fat loss itself, or the amount of fat that he has on his body, or if it's just the calorie deficit itself that leads to this uncontrolled eating measure, or the lack of fat intake, or, the overconsumption of protein, or, whatever it might be. Like, those kinds of things are things that we need more studies on. We need to actually investigate that a lot more. But ultimately, the point being that he had greater urges or greater want for uncontrolled eating as a result of whatever was happening throughout this dieting phase. So to wrap up, to put things into perspective, this is not the ideal situation. He did not really go about his training all that fantastic. I mean, he was murdering himself in the gym, even at, reps in reserve of like 3 or 4. He just did so much work. His energy, like his nutrition wasn't, if he had spoken to a nutritionist, if the researchers had offered him a nutritionist, that might have helped, because eating, 300 grams of protein is completely unnecessary. Even for like satiety, that seems definitely excessive. But overall, he had a fantastic physique. And so he certainly accomplished what he wanted to accomplish, to get down to really, really low body fat percentage. And we saw that he had to decrease his calories substantially, a 40% reduction from where he was pre-study, so before his dieting began. We talked about how he lost substantial body fat, but he also lost some lean mass, some fat-free mass. Probably some of that was from musculature, especially near the tail end of his dieting phase. So that's something else to consider. His resting metabolic rate stayed largely stable for the first 4 months or so, then just absolutely tanked once he got into that competition range. And then we talked about blood glucose, blood pressure, cholesterol. All of those decreased a little bit, then rebounded back up to their normal levels, or roughly their normal levels. Testosterone was really interesting because that tanked, over a 60% drop in testosterone over the 6 months of dieting, but then also rebounded extremely quickly. You saw increases in bound testosterone, which was unfortunate, but those also receded after the initial 30 days of refeeding, or I should call it, I guess you could call it refeeding, just a point where he's increasing his calories and his fat consumption and carbohydrates and things like that. Saw a decline in T3, so thyroid hormone, or thyroid, and that was pre-competition, and then over 50% decline, which then rebounded over time. And then white blood cell count, I just wanted a quick mention as well, also declined. So maybe that might make him more at risk for infections. We don't actually know that. Again, you'd have to actually test that to be 100% certain. But, is it conceivable? Yeah, definitely. Okay, so those are kind of the highlights. I hope that you got something out of this episode. I hope that if you watch this live, I have not looked at the live stream, so I don't know if this actually worked or not. I really hope it did, but if it didn't, then, just more problem solving for me. But if you're listening to the podcast, then thanks for stopping by, and I hope that this was really informative. And I hope if you're listening to the podcast, please share or like the episode, or leave a review if you're able to. And thanks for stopping by, and I hope to have the pleasure of speaking with you in the future. Have a good one, guys. See ya.